Which number is mine? Ah, looks like all of them. Okay. Maybe 4? My 4?
This is gonna be the bloopers, by the way.
Perfect. Oh yeah, as soon as we turn the cameras on,
It's on.
it's dangerous.
What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of Lingucast. Today, we're going to talk about a very special topic with a very special guest, the legendary Dr. Stanley.
Hey.
Today, we're gonna get our bloods boiled.
Oh,
So,
wow.
we're gonna talk about sociolinguistics and how it affects people. Well, people are very sensitive about stuff, but let's start with like this. What's linguistics?
What is linguistics?
Yes.
I think if you look at Wikipedia, it says it's the scientific study of language, which I guess is a pretty good definition.
That's good.
Yeah.
Straightforward. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in linguistics, how you developed a passion for language and got into this field.
Yeah, great question. So I started off, I was a super band nerd in high school. I'd been playing piano since I was a kid, and I was convinced that I was going to be the next John Williams. I was going to write movie music.
Cool.
And so my freshman year here at BYU, I was a music student and was involved in that. And then I went on my mission. I got called to Brazil and I was asked to speak Portuguese. And I had never studied another language before. I didn't need to graduate from high school, and BYU didn't require it to get in. So I just didn't. And that was the first time I was like, oh, language is cool. That was fun. And I remember the thing that was really fascinating to me was, so in Portuguese and like lots of other languages, you put the noun first instead of the adjective. So instead of a white house, you would say house white. And in English, we would put the adjective first. And to me, it just sounded so wrong. Like, how does that make sense to put the noun first? But then it occurred to me that there were 200 million people in that country who, for them, it's totally wrong to put the adjective first and to put the noun second. And so that was just a really like eye-opening thing to me, that like people think about language in a very different way than what I do. Interesting. I'm not super into syntax anymore, but that was the thing that got me interested in linguistics.
Huh.
Anyway, so I got back and very quickly switched out of my music major and switched into linguistics and haven't looked back. I think let's see, I started winter semester, so like January, and the first day of class was a Wednesday, and I took a music class, and I was like, yeah, this is the first day of the rest of my life. It's gonna be, music major. And I think by Sunday night I had switched majors. Like it all happened really quickly. So yeah, so that was my start into linguistics. When I was in my intro to linguistics class, I remember learning about phonetics and thinking, this is great, IPA is super cool. And then we moved on to morphology, and I was like, what is this? Like, I thought linguistics was just phonetics. Like I was like, oh, there's more to linguistics than just sounds. But I remember learning about the fourth floor study that LeBeouf did, and I remember thinking that was super cool. So I think from very early on, I was already interested in like accents and dialects and phonetics and stuff. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, we're going to talk about the fourth floor study, which is it's very important for this conversation here. And so next question I'm thinking about is, what's your specialty in linguistics?
Yeah, so I do what's called sociolinguistics, which is very broadly how language interacts with society. So I'm interested in language variation. I'm particularly interested in pronunciation, usually vowels, and mostly American English. I tell people that I'm interested in things like Utah English and Western American English, and they say, "Oh, but we don't have an accent." And then I tell them, and I'm also interested in why you think that. So I'm interested in language attitudes and people's thoughts about language and stuff. So it all broadly falls under the umbrella of sociolinguistics.
Very cool. So, you do dialectology together with, or as a part of, sociolinguistics, is that right?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that subdiscipline is and what you do with it?
Yeah, so nowadays dialectology is a subfield of sociolinguistics, but when it first started, it was like sociolinguistics was a subfield of dialectology. But anyway, very broadly, dialectology is the study of regional variation. So how do accents change across geographic space? Dialectology has actually been around for quite a while in its modern sense. There are studies that go back over 100 years in early Germany and in France. people studied various regional accents and things like that.
Cool.
And it wasn't until about the 1960s that people started to look at sociolinguistics and look at language variation within a single place and look at how social variables like socioeconomic status may have an effect on language variation. But dialectology is very broadly, the regional variation in how language is patterns across geographic space.
Cool. So, and you said you mainly focus in like Western United States.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I'm here now, and so it makes it easy to collect data when you actually live in the place that you're collecting data from.
Yeah.
I got my PhD at the University of Georgia, and so for several years when I was a student there, I was on a team of researchers that looked at English in the southern United States and specifically in Georgia. So I'm continuing those collaborations, and so I do publish pretty regularly on English in Georgia. But my real interest, like when you talk to me in an informal sense, like now, I mostly talk about English in the Western United States. Part of the reason is because I'm not from here, and so I feel like I'm a little bit of an outsider, which gives me a nice outsider's perspective, a little more objective view on it.
Yeah.
Another reason is because there's really not a lot of research done in English in the Western states. Maybe there's a fair amount in California and to some extent like Seattle and Oregon, but not so much like the Rocky Mountain area. So Utah's a great place because we've got lots of language variation here, and there's really not a lot of studies that have been done. There have been a handful, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of potential for relatively easy publications because there's just a lot of work that can still be done. So
yeah, that's pretty cool.
And then other places like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, I think I can count the number of studies that have looked at those 3 states on one hand, like combined. Like there's about 2 or 3 in Idaho, 2 or 3 in Montana, and as far as I know, 0 that have looked at English in Wyoming. So yes, there are relatively few people there compared to like California, but that doesn't mean it's not worthy of study. And so since I'm closer, I mean, I'm not super close, but closer to those areas, it's fun to start to collect some data from people that grew up there and see what people sound like. So
yeah.
So you mentioned that you often encounter people who say, but I got no accent. I don't have an accent. They got an accent. How does that idea of having no accent work?
Yeah.
So he also plays for those who were like, yeah, I want to speak English like a native speaker, and then someone like you is like, huh.
Right. Yeah. So there's this idea that there is such a thing as not having an accent, and it's not really a good analogy, or it's not really a good idea to have because it's like saying you have hair but you don't have a hair color, or it's like saying you're wearing jeans but your jeans have no color, or it's like saying you're typing in a font but you're typing but you're not using a font. I mean, yes, jeans are usually blue. There is a default that is the most common and probably is what most people think of when they think of jeans. There are fonts that are seen as not flashy. They're just sort of basic fonts that you see all the time, but they are fonts, and you have to type using some sort of font. And so that's how it is with language. Like when you use language, you have to do it in some sort of accent. And that accent may be considered by some people to be the correct way or the pure way or the standard, but it is an accent. And so just because it's not like, just because it's a common way of speaking, that's a way that is taught to foreigners, it's a way that you see on TV and movies and things like that, doesn't mean it's not an accent. It just means it's an accent that has been elevated to this arbitrary status of being standard, but it doesn't make it any better or worse than any other accent.
Can you give us how we as a society, United States or Latin America or even Brazil or every country whatsoever, develop this idea of, okay, this is the standard. What makes something standard? From what you have seen, from your perspective, and from evidence.
Yeah. So standard is really interesting because I think I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think it's a relatively recent idea. I think prior to, certainly before like the printing press, there was no such thing as a standard, I don't think. I think people just spoke the way they did, and people were aware of regional variation, but they didn't think anything of it. They just said, we sound this way and they sound that way. But as some people took on more elevated positions in society, colonization and things and other, inequalities that have been inserted into society, people start to view how language is used by marginalized people and say that's wrong. And the way that I speak, because I'm in this elevated status, that's right. And there's no real reason for why the language of rich people is considered standard, other than they're the ones in power. They're the ones that can impose that
Right.
upon us. So in the United States, for example, Afro-American English is something that is pretty stigmatized. And it would be a weird thing for me as a white person to start speaking in Afro-American English. And it would be weird for a foreigner to come to the United States and learn Afro-American English exclusively and not learn standard American English.
Sure.
People would be very upset if they taught Afro-American English in the schools. And so it's by many measures very stigmatized. But there's no reason for it. Like, it's not like it's objectively worse than standard American English or any other variety of English. It's not like it's inherently less logical or less you can't there are lots of things that people have said about it, and it really comes down to Americans are really racist, and so they don't like the way those people talk, and so therefore the way those people talk is considered bad. Like, it really comes down to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you know, like, normally, because I remember taking a class with you last semester, and you talking about, actually, you mentioned this class too, that they took the map of the U.S., found the most white place, and they're like, this is how you ought to speak.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't quite like that, but
How
yeah.
I'm-
So
I'm
like,
curious
I mean, I don't know if you can like tell a story, but when you look across the world, the accents that are considered standard in those countries are usually the accents that are associated with the largest economic power or the largest cultural center or just the largest city. So you think of Seoul, Korea, or Moscow, Russia, or Paris, or London, or all these capital cities are considered standard. There are a few exceptions. So like Brazil is an interesting case where it's not quite considered standard. I'm not sure what standard Brazilian Portuguese would be.
That's a very interesting, because they're not aware of it. It's like, this person has no regional trace. And I listened to that. I was like, yeah, they do.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's not like a hard and fast rule. I think Iceland is another case where the rural areas of Iceland are considered standard. But the United States, so we don't think of Washington D.C. as being standard American English. We don't think of New York City. I mean, California to some extent, but you can exaggerate and make fun of a California accent. In fact, they did in SNL. There's a sketch called The Californians. I think there were maybe 6 or so episodes of that. I mean, episodes. And so California accent, like in an exaggerated way, isn't really considered standard either. So, where is considered, and so the reason why is, in the 1920s and 30s, when they started to have more mass media like radio and things, they needed to sort of have this broadcast standard because that's what they felt like was an important thing to do. And so they're like, well, we can't get people from New York because it's contaminated by all those Jews and all those Italians and all those Irish people. And we can't have anybody in the South because their English is contaminated by all those Afro-Americans. We can't have people from Chicago because they're contaminated by all these other. And so where do they go? They go to the whitest part of the country. They go to like the Midwest, and not just any kind of white, but it's like Anglo-Saxon white and like Scandinavian white. So you look at like the Midwest is where the regional standard became the national standard. And it really comes down to Americans 100 years. I mean, it's not exactly gone now, but 100 years ago were super racist and super xenophobic, and they didn't want their language to be contaminated by all these outside influences. And so they chose the one they perceived to be the purest as far as ethnically, however they want to define that, and that's sort of what comes out of it now. So this all comes from a book called Race and the Rise of Standard American by, what if I forget their first name? Last name is Bonfiglio in 2002. Super good book. You kind of have to read the whole thing. It's an interesting writing style, but I think it's because of that, it has really made me rethink my relationship with standard American English. And I think once people start to realize maybe the racist undertones that come along with what with standard American English, maybe we can all start to rethink why we are promoting this, and maybe we could not maybe think as highly of it as we once did.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting as you're describing kind of the parallels or the development of like kind of societal ways of thinking, societal norms together with language and how those kind of went together. I hadn't really even considered that before, like a standardization of like printed text, like there wouldn't have necessarily been a sense of like a standard spoken language. Um, but it must be very like eye-opening for you to see kind of at this intersection of language and society, like what prejudices there are, what kinds of, and that a lot of things go unnoticed, I think, in the general population. But could you share some more insights about just kind of this, perhaps like the prejudices and injustices, things that you see at this intersection?
Yeah. So, I mean, something that I see is that people are very proud when they believe they don't have an accent. And like, yeah, well, I don't have an accent. And I talk about things like Utah English. And I have students like, well, I grew up in Tooele or Salt Lake or Provo, but I don't have a Utah accent. I'm like, so what's your accent then? Minnesota? Like, what? You by definition have a Utah accent if you're from Utah. Like, oh no, but Utah accent is what my grandparents speak because they grew up in Vernal or St. George or somewhere that's not here.
Interesting.
And so people are very proud to, when they believe they don't have an accent. Accents are things that other people have, but I don't have it. And so when you have this idea that accents are something that only uh, people that are less good than me. So like, oh, I have education and I'm smart and I'm just the center of the universe,
Mm,
and people have this sort of what's the word, um, main character syndrome, where
right.
they think they're the best, and they see other people who sound different from them or use language in a different way from them. I think the first impression people might have is like, well, that's wrong, and so if you think that someone is just wrong, like, oh, why are they sounding that way? It's because they're just are they just too stupid to sound like me? I'm smart, of course, and so I was able to overcome these barriers of not sounding like that, but they're too dumb to fully understand. And I don't know if these are conscious thoughts that go through
Right.
people's minds, but if someone who sounds relatively standard thinks less of someone because that person does not sound relatively standard, that's a pretty judgy thing to do.
Yeah.
I think nowadays in society, we know that we shouldn't judge other people based on their race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or religion or anything like that. But it's still really okay. Like society says it's okay to still judge people based on their grammar. This is sort of, I think people have called it like the last holdout of whatever discrimination.
Interesting.
It's something like that. In a lot of like the diversity and inclusion statements you see that companies have or universities have. They say we don't judge people based on this. We have equal hiring things, and they list this handful of things and things that I never really considered. Things like veteran status or pregnancy status. Things like, oh, okay, I
Sure.
probably shouldn't judge people on that, but they never include language. And so I'm not saying that not including it gives us license to judge people and to have prejudice based on that. But I think including it would be a really nice thing to do. Is like, oh, we should probably be aware that we shouldn't judge people based on their language or their language variety. Um, so yeah, I think this mentality of standard English is the best, and therefore I'm good, and
Mhm.
you guys are not good,
Right.
is like that's a very broad thing that happens, and I think we could probably talk about more specific examples of how that's played out. But that idea, I think, is pretty pervasive, and I don't think it's a good idea, a good idea to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And how are, like you said, people are very unaware of their own accent.
Hmm.
How are have you seen? Can you give that example where people where people's like, yeah, I don't sound like that, and then you're like, yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Like people are not aware of the accent, and I've seen that myself with I was doing an experiment with my cousin for his class actually. He's like, yeah, you need to sound kinda like I do, like this. I'm like, you have, these," I'm like, and I was just thinking he has these and these traits that indicate that they're from the north side of Brazil,
Right.
but he's not aware of that.
Right.
So how does that
Yeah, so I can think of 3 interesting cases. One is, Bill Above in the 1960s and 70s, he was interested in R dropping in New York City. So people saying the word car as like ka, or the word for, or like sauce sounding the same as the word, source sounding the same as sauce. So like sauce. So he was interested in that in the 1960s, and there was one case where he was interviewing a mother and her daughter, and he went. Back then, they often interviewed people over multiple sessions, and so
Mm.
he was interviewing them, and they're I guess very openly made fun of people who drop their R's, and he's like, "But you drop your R's," and they're like, "No, we don't. No, we don't." And he's like, "No, I'm pretty sure you do." So he went back and found a clip of them dropping their R's and played it for them.
Wow.
And I forget exactly how he phrased it, but he said it was disheartening in a way that's painful to see. Like he said, like they were so like their pride in their own speech was completely shattered because of that. And so when you point things out to people, non-standard things in their speech, they don't like it, and they often change their speech pretty drastically because of it.
Wow.
And so people are just not aware of the non-standardness in their speech. There's another one. This is from Nancy Najelski in 1999. She was interested in Michigan, and a fair number of studies in Michigan have shown that that Michiganders are pretty linguistically secure. They think they're God's gift to American English. That that American English is based on how they talk, even though it's pretty well documented that there's this thing called the Northern Cities shift that is pretty common in places like
What is Northern Cities?
oh yeah, so the Northern City shift is a vowel shift that it's basically the stereotyped Chicago accent. So like Chicago, where you had this going up to an ah sound, and there's a whole shift of vowels here. And I don't do a lot of research on it, so I can't really imitate it very well. But it's sort of like a exaggerated like northern accent, northern United States. Anyway, places like Detroit have this pretty strongly,
Mm.
or at least they did. And so what she did is she collected recordings of people and found that they have the Northern City shift in their speech. This thing that's relatively stigmatized. She then later played clips of a person speaking. It's a little bit complicated how she did it, but the point is she played three versions of it. One version sounded northern, one person sounded standard, one person sounded maybe in a different way. And the people, I think almost all of them said, I sound like the person that sounds standard and not like the person that sounds like them, which is northern. And so they literally didn't hear their own accent, and they couldn't
Wow.
identify someone saying, yeah, that person sounds like me. They look towards the standard and say, no, that's what I sound like.
Wow.
And so Dennis Preston, who is a linguist who does a lot of this perceptual dialectology stuff, he said about this, he said, your brain gets in the way of your ear, where you have these ideas about language and about your own language, and that prohibits you, or it blocks you from hearing what's actually going on.
Crazy.
I see that now in Utah. So this is my third example. So in Utah, you get the word mountain and other similar words like Leighton and satin, button, kitten, gluten, where you get this T followed by like an unstressed vowel or a nasal. And across the United States, it's very common across like media, podcasts, audiobooks, like radio, you say mountain, where you get a glottal stop followed by a syllabic nasal, mountain. Well, in Utah, people think that they're the only ones that do that. And there's a long story that I could go into. I'm probably not going to have time to do that. But in Utah, people are convinced that they're the only ones that use these glottal stops. And so now in Utah, they don't like that. And so they start to say mountain with a nice clear T. Mountain is a normal way of saying it when you're in more careful settings, like if you're in a job interview or if you're giving a talk or some sort of more formal or more careful situation. But when you're talking casually with your friends, you're not going to say, oh, I'm gluten free, or I saw this satin thing the other day, or I was holding a kitten, or you have these nice strong T's in places that you don't normally hear them across the rest of the country. But in Utah, you do. And so this is an interesting case where Utahns don't hear the standardness in their speech. What they're doing is they're hyper correcting toward this like fictitious standard that doesn't actually exist.
Wow.
And by doing so, they're now creating their own unique Utah accent that is like a hyper corrected version of it. So look, what I like to say about this is Utahns sound Utah when they avoid sounding Utah. They don't want to sound like they have a Utah accent, so this pendulum swings and now they have this other Utah accent, but really they don't realize that the rest of the country says mountain just like they do. And so that's another fun case of that.
Language is so fun.
Yeah, normally this reminds me of the Brazilian example of the São Paulo rhotic R, ra, like porta. But then you go to the central region, Mato Grosso and Goiás, they also use that. And people are not aware of it. And I'm actually doing a study exactly on that.
Oh, cool.
And so this is very interesting. How is having your accent, even if it's, I would say, stigmatized related to the identity. He's like, that's my accent, is my identity. How's that related?
Yeah, so I think it's been shown that pretty conclusive that language is an integral part to someone's identity. How someone talks and how they is part of how they present themselves. Just as the way that we talk, or sorry, the way that we walk and the way that we dress and the way that we behave, we all make these choices to help portray the kind of persona that we want ourselves to be. And persona maybe not quite the right word, but sort of we want to show who we are, and we do so by portraying ourselves in some sort of outside way so that other people can look at us or interact with us and get an idea of who we are. And so when you're, you change the way you dress depending on the situation. So if you're in a job interview or somewhere more formal, you might wear more formal clothes. But if you're on the beach, you're gonna wear a swimsuit. It would be inappropriate to wear the other one in the other setting. And so, language is all part of this package of how we present ourselves. And so a lot of times what we see is that for people who want to portray themselves as cosmopolitan and just keeping up with the times and tech and hip, I guess hip is not quite the right word, but just sort of like cool and contemporary, want to portray themselves as sounding standard. They don't want to be pinned down to any particular region. So it's important for them to sound standard because that's part of the package that they're trying to show. For other people, that part of their identity is not as important, and so they want to show other parts of their identity. Like they want to show that they are a cowboy, or they want to show that they belong to a particular social group or some particular ethnic group. And so they use language and language variants in such a way that helps create that persona, or that helps them express that identity.
I've seen that with Arab Americans, especially when they're talking about Islamic terms. They will overpronounce some words. Not all of them, but like I've seen Americans saying Eid. It's like, but it was like Eid, but in Arabic they would say Eid, since they can't do the pharyngeal fricative very well in English. Although a lot of them will just say Eid. I'm like, interesting, but in other words they will get closer to the actual Arabic pronunciation.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, very interesting.
So I guess sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. How do we get from this kind of stigmatization of language? How does that affect people in like a larger scale? Like how does that get outside of just like the way I'm using my language? Or for example, like in my friend group, sometimes people will like tease each other, but how does that get to a more kind of like larger scale issue?
Yeah, so I teach a class on African English, and so a lot of my examples come from that. And so there are some cases, for example, of children who are African American. They grew up in an African American family. They speak African American English in the home. That's how they learn language. That's the very normal way of using language for them. And then they get thrown into a public school. Let's say they're in a suburb that is predominantly white, and most of their peers in their kindergarten class are white and grew up speaking something close to standard American English. Now suddenly this black child in a predominantly white school is faced with this interesting situation where they're the ones that sound different. Suddenly they're different, whereas their entire lives they mostly talk to their families, and they realize that and they didn't think anything of it. But now they're the ones that are different, which mean and the medium of instruction in public schools is often standard American English or something close to it. And so now the white children who grew up speaking standard American English don't have any barriers to learning because they speak the same variety of English that the teacher speaks. But this black child now has to learn standard American English, or at least learn to understand or learn how to learn in standard American English. That's an additional barrier that's there that the white children don't have that they don't have. We see it then too on the playground. You get the white children who are making fun of the black children because of the way they speak. And we also see it in some teachers where it's like, oh, this black child doesn't know how to conjugate verbs. The black child is saying we be going to the store instead of we are going to store. Therefore, they don't understand language. They have some cognitive disability in some way. And so we have to put them in special ed or put them in some sort of speech class, which they don't need. There's no special ed or no cognitive thing. It's just they're using a different variety of language.
Yeah.
And so now, not only is this child getting the quote unquote help that they don't actually need, they're now being pulled out of class, which means they're missing instruction. And so now they're just falling behind simply because the people that are in charge don't understand what African American English is. So I think we see that across the country with a lot of people that speak non-standard accents. We see it with African American English. We see it in even among white people, with like Southern American English, which is often associated or with a lack of education or ruralness or poverty or things like that. And so when children come in with a strong Southern accent, the teachers assume things about them, that they're not as smart, that they don't have as many resources, and so therefore they must not be as good at school. We got to help them and put them into special ed. We see it with lots of things across the country and around the world. But the case of African American children, I think, is the most poignant because it's probably the most widespread and people aren't super aware of it.
Yeah.
This brings on to another interesting thing, African American English. So if you're from Brazil or anywhere in the world, in America, there's this thing called the white people accent and the black people accent. Apparently, they sound different. In people, they just based on audio, people can tell them apart. And what is African American English? How does that work? And just give us an intro.
Yeah.
Educate us.
I mean, it's the language that's spoken by African Americans, predominantly the people that are descendants of formerly enslaved people in the United States. So you don't see this too much among like first or second generation Africans. It's usually people that are the product of, or that are the descendants of formerly enslaved people. So it's just the language that they use. There's a huge variety of what it is. You get some people that speak relatively close to standard American English or standard white English. You get other people that speak something that's quite drastically different from standard American English, and all of that is under the umbrella of African American English because it's all spoken by African Americans.
And how does it differ from standard English?
Oh geez, there's a lot of ways that it's different. So there are some pronunciation things. It shares a lot of similarities with like white Southern American English. So saying the word, five as five, you might have this monophonization there. You have some consonants that are a little bit different. So in some groups of people, you get consonant clusters where you get multiple consonants at the end of a word, and those consonants might be dropped. And so instead of saying best, where we have a T there in standard American English, you might hear people just say the word best, where you drop that T there. There's a whole bunch of grammar things. And so there's this thing called habitual be, where you use this word be just as it is. You don't get is, was, or word, just the word be. And it often refers to some ongoing action that sort of habitually happens or happens every once in a while. So things like I be going to the store on Thursday nights or something like that, which implies, I don't know if that's even the correct way of saying it. Hopefully people who are not experts in who are experts in African American English can forgive me for not having the best examples. But it's something that implies some sort of ongoing action or something that happens all the time. You could have a sentence like John be running, which just means that's something that he does a lot. He runs every morning or something like that. There's a whole bunch of other grammatical things that have to do with it, or that are part of African American English. You have other forms of the verb be are often dropped, and so you can say like he cool or she cool instead of he is cool, she is cool. There's some systematicity to that, so you can get that pretty commonly in the third person, but you don't get it in the first person. So I can say she cool and you cool, but you can't say I cool. You do have to say I am cool. And there's a whole bunch of other things, but because it's been a semester since I taught it, I don't have those quite fresh on my mind right now. There's a lot of syntactic constructions as well that are a little bit hard to explain without a diagram and things. There are some lexical things as well, so they use words in a different way. There are words that are pretty unique to African American English. So what's the word? Kitchen, I think, is one. Kitchen.
That was like a hair.
Yeah,
That's really just a
yeah.
hair, right?
So it's sort of the hair sort of on the lowest end of the hair back there, which is often a little bit wispy and curly, and there are people, do things about it because it's seen as unattractive. There are products you can buy. The verb to stay can often mean to live somewhere. So you can say that I stayed in Georgia for 7 years, which is not how I would normally use that word. I can kind of get that same reading, but I don't quite use the word stay that way. Whereas in African American English, you do get that. You can say that I stayed here for a while. I stayed there for a while, to mean that you lived there. And then there's a whole bunch of like pragmatic things, how you actually use language. There's a lot of discoursal things. There's a whole bunch of other things, but there's some intonational things. Any aspect of language that you can think of, there's something that can be a little bit different among some African Americans. And so in many ways, African American English is different from standard American English. And I can't like list all of them, but yeah.
Sure.
So normally, I've seen the most commonly misunderstood aspect of African American English from my experience is the habitual be. So like, Sophie be filming podcasts. A standard American English speaker would think, oh, she is filming podcasts right now.
Right.
But an African American would understand, like, oh yeah, she habitually once a week films podcasts.
Yeah.
So that would say, so they would, the same sentence, but both would understand it completely differently.
Yeah. It is interesting to see how features of like African American English have kind of gotten into like pop culture, and then but like you're saying, there's kind of a lot of misunderstanding that we don't actually get the systematicity of it or different things. But
yeah, I mean, there's a case when I first moved to Georgia, there are a lot of African Americans there, and so we went to Walmart, and I was looking for a job because I wasn't going to start grad school for a year, and so I just was sort of asking around for job applications, and so I went to Walmart and I was buying my things, and I talked to the cashier, who was Black, and I asked if Walmart was hiring, and she said, "We be hiring." And I knew things about African American English at that point. So most people might interpret that to mean we are hiring perhaps right now. And that be, she just failed to conjugate that be. And so because she's uneducated or whatever thoughts go through people's minds. But because I had some familiar with African American English, I knew that we be hiring means we're always hiring. It's something that we just always do. Like it's an ongoing thing. And so at any point I could have turned in an application. I never did, but I could have, and I could have at any point because I knew that they be hiring instead of simply they were hiring at that time.
And how do, I would say, African Americans or even minority communities code switch depending on the situation? So they a lot of them do that. A lot of them are not able to do that. How does this dynamic work?
Yeah. So when it comes to using language, all language and language variants have what's called the indexicality, or this baggage that's associated with it. We've kind of touched on this, where like Southern American English is associated with being poor or being rural or being Southern or things like that. But there's no inherent reason for that. It's just this arbitrary meaning that's assigned to it, all the connotations and stuff. African American English has quite a lot of this, and it indexes a lot of these things having to do with African American culture. And it's a sign of, being part of the culture to be able to have some command of African American English. But African American English, so while it may be stigmatized in many ways by a lot of non-Black people, it is seen as locally very prestigious. It's a good thing to be able to have some command of African American English, even if society and the schools and mainstream American culture tell us that it's a bad thing. So among each other, African Americans often use African American English because it's just something that they do to help express their identity. They want to show each other that they're inside this community, and that's just the way that you talk to each other. But they've learned that when you're talking to maybe a white person or talking in some situations where African English is seen as inappropriate, and then people will switch to something that's closer to mainstream American English. Some people have a wide linguistic repertoire where they can switch from something that's quite drastically different from standard American English and then instantly switch to something that's very much standard. Just as people can switch between Spanish and English
Sure.
with no problem. Other people maybe have a little less of a linguistic repertoire. So depending on how much exposure they have to standard American English, they might be able to code switch a little bit towards standard American English, but not quite fully get there. And depending on how much interaction an African American has with other African Americans, let's say they move to a predominantly white suburb, they may mostly sound like other white people and sound mostly standard and not have full command of the fullest African American English, and so they have a relatively limited repertoire as well.
If they can move, right? Tell us about. Do you know what we're going to? Like if if they can move, what is it the discrimination thing with how's
Oh, right. Yeah.
because this was because you mentioned housing like then he clicked me because a lot of them can't even move because
Right.
of that.
This is interesting.
Well, I think everybody can
can.
code switch and style shift, but not everybody can code switch to standard American English. Not everyone can pass as white. And so this is a problem because, like you said earlier, people are pretty good at identifying the race of an American English speaker, whether they're white or black, based on their voice alone. And it's not even just like with intonation. There have been studies, like very controlled studies, where you get someone to read a bunch of numbers and you can tell the ethnicity of the person. Sometimes they played a clip of just a single vowel sound and you can still tell, which is pretty crazy. And it's nothing to do with like skull shape or anything like the phrenology stuff. Like it really is like, because any black person can sound perfectly white. I'm using terms that are maybe not the best way, but anybody who's born black can sound white if, like we see this in children that are adopted into white homes. So like it's nothing to do with biology that makes them sound that way. It's something that's much more there's more agentivity going on there. Anyway, but some people don't have full command of standard American English and can't necessarily pass as white, just as I could never pass as black because I have no command of African American English. And so this is a problem if you get someone who is racist and here's someone who sounds black, they're gonna impose their racist attitudes on them. So this was a study done by John Baugh in the late 90s. John Baugh is a fascinating linguist for many ways, but one of the ways is that he's natively tri-dialectal. So he is African American, but he grew up in Philadelphia for some of his life and like Southern California for some of his life. And so he is a native speaker of standard American English, what he calls his professional voice. He's a native speaker of African American English, and then he's also a native speaker of Chicano English. And so being tri-dialectal is really interesting for him. And because he has full command of his three varieties of English, he can switch to his professional voice anytime that he wants. And so if he needs to, for example, call someone, he often switches to his professional sounding voice if he doesn't know the person that he's talking to. What he noticed when he moved to California is when he would call people, and he noticed that if he sounded black, he was often denied the opportunity to tour a home, like an apartment. And so he thought, I think there's some systemic racism going on here. So he conducted a study. He went through the newspaper, because that's how it was done in the 1990s, and he found, I think, something like 215 or 250 vacancies for apartments. So he cold called them, and the first time he called them, he tossed a coin to decide whether he was going to sound black or sound Chicano. And he would call them and say the exact same thing. It was something like, "Hi, I'm calling about the apartment that you have listed in the paper." And people would say, "Oh yes, it's open. Do you want to come by and schedule a tour?" Or they would say, "Oh no, it's actually been filled." So if it was the case that people said no, or no, it's been filled, he would wait 15 minutes, use his other non-standard accent, and call and say the exact same thing. And so if he sounded Chicano at first, then he sounded black, and sometimes he was told no a second time. He would wait 15 minutes, call back in his professional voice, and suddenly that apartment became very available to him. And so he's like, "Oh, this is really interesting." So he did this for about 215 or so apartments, and he found that there are some parts of California where if you called and sounded not white, you were denied the opportunity to tour that house
Mm.
much more than other white sounding people were. So he's like, this is a bad thing because he's like, I'm fortunate because I can switch to my professional sounding voice. And so I don't have, I don't have to overcome this. But some people don't have the opportunity or don't have the linguistic repertoire to switch into their standard sounding voice. And so they have to call someone sounding black. And if that person doesn't want to offer housing to someone who sounds black, then they're not going to do it. And so that person is going to be denied housing. And that's like just flat out racism. And so because of John Baugh's research, now like housing discrimination is a thing that people are aware of, and there are now laws that are passed saying you can't do that. So this is this is one of the cases where sociolinguistic research like very clearly has uncovered an aspect of people's lives that are affected by the way they talk, and sociolinguists did something about it, and now the world is a little bit of a better place because people, in theory, aren't discriminated against because of the way they speak.
Yeah. What a fascinating study.
Fascinating study.
It is fascinating. He's super cool.
So what now? I think that African American English is becoming more accepted. Would you say that?
In some cases, I don't think it would be super appropriate to hear it in really formal settings. But I'm not into hip hop at all, but my understanding is that hip hop is very closely tied to African American English, that they use a lot of constructions from African American English, like grammatical and pronunciation things in hip hop and hip hop culture. And so for people that are not black who want to, who like that kind of music and that lifestyle and culture, they also will start to adopt some of those features. And so it's very often the case that that people who are into hip hop start to adopt features of African American because it's seen as a cool thing. And so in that sense, yes, it's not seen as stigmatized all the time. But imagine a white person going to school and sounding like they do when they're doing hip hop or things like that. Like the teacher would still be pretty upset about it and would tell them, why are you talking that way? So there is sort of this grassroots level what do you call it, prestige going on, where if you're into hip hop, you kind of need to sound this way. You need to adopt these features of African American English, but people understand that that's only confined to certain contexts, and there's still many other situations where it would not be appropriate, or people see it as not appropriate to use features of African American English.
Speaking of school, tell us about the Ebonics controversy. About that.
So this was, I think, January of 1997. So this was another sort of late 90s thing. So this was Oakland school district in California. I think over half of their students were black, and they noticed that a large portion of their black students were in things like special ed and needed help in various ways. They noticed that, so they had a lot of children who spoke Spanish at home in their school district, and those students were getting the help that they needed. So they offered bilingual education and things like that because the students couldn't succeed in standard American English, and everyone recognizes that. And so they offer things, support for them so that they can succeed in school. Well, the Oakland School Board was like, you know what? We kind of see the same barriers for the African American children that we have in our school. Maybe we can propose that we have some sort of help, maybe similar in style or similar in theory to what the Spanish speaking children have, so that our African American English speaking children can have a little more success in school. The term they used at the time was Ebonics, so that we don't really use that term nowadays, actually, because of that controversy. So that kind of killed that word.
Wow.
But that's the term that they use for what is now called African American English or African American Vernacular English or African American language. So they put together a resolution that says, hey, we think that it would be helpful for our students to have some measures in place to help them succeed in school. And some of the things we would like to do is acknowledge that they speak a little bit differently from their white peers, and maybe offer some support to help bridge the gap between what the way they speak at home compared to the way that we expect them to speak at school.
Right.
So they put together this resolution. They had no idea how much the public would not like it. It was not really an internal memo, but it was not something that they intended for the world to see.
Sure.
Well, the world saw it, and people did not like it at all. There were some things that maybe could have been phrased a little bit differently, but the country really misinterpreted what was going on there. They saw it as, we declare Ebonics as a separate language.
Hmm.
We declare we do this so that we can get more government funding, so that we can offer bilingual education. We will train our teachers to teach math and English and science in Ebonics. We will teach your white children Ebonics. These are things that
Right.
people interpreted it as, and none of those were true. And really, in reality, what they wanted to have done is, we want to acknowledge to students, hey, you speak a little bit differently at home. Here's how we expect you to speak at school. Let's point out the systematic differences between them, and that we can help you bridge the gap.
Yeah.
But people didn't like that, and so it was a national frenzy for, like, through end of December or early January, 96 to 97. And lots of people chimed in with their own thoughts about what was going on. The president of the United States at the time had opinions. Lots of people have thoughts about this, and they have people are entitled to their thoughts. But what this really uncovered, this is stuff that Walt Wolfram, a linguist at North Carolina State, talked about, is that it really uncovered language ideologies and language biases that people have.
Yeah.
Because we all speak a language, we all feel qualified to talk about language, even though that's not true. Like, just because I have eyes doesn't mean I'm qualified to do eye surgery. But people have thoughts about language, and there's this idea that the ideologies that they have are just common sense. So ideologies like, there is a standard, and that standard is correct, and other things are wrong, and people should be speaking this standard. And those are so ingrained in people as common sense that they assume that any reasonable person would have those same thoughts. And if you don't have those same thoughts, then you're just crazy, and there's something wrong with you. Just as if someone says, I don't know, what kind of like idea, like, murder is not a bad thing. It's like, okay, that's a weird thing. We all acknowledge that that's a thing.
Right.
People equate language to not to murder, but like, maybe that's what's in the best example. But people just have these thoughts about language, and they assume that everybody should have these thoughts. And so when the Oakland School Board says, hey, maybe it's a good thing to acknowledge that people sound differently, people are like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Why in the world would we do that?
Right.
I think people sound that way because they're just too dumb, or they're aiming for standard, but they're just, they miss the mark because of whatever dysfunction they have in their life. And so why should we acknowledge this disability that they have? We should just, hammer in the standard to them. And so there's a whole like Senate hearing, like it went all the way to the Senate. They brought in linguists, because most linguists actually defended the Oakland School Board. They said, look, this is backed up by lots of research. It's been done in other countries. This is a thing that works. And then they brought in people that are just like, have opinions, like a columnist and a preacher, who are like, well, I'm black and I don't sound that way, and so they should also not sound that way, because, and it's like, well, you have a lot of privilege in your life and you have a lot of opportunities to sound the way you do. These children don't.
Right.
And so, but it's just crazy to me to think that a columnist and a preacher were seen as equal in standard as far as qualifications to talk about this to the Senate as linguists who study African American English.
Right.
And people thought, it was like, yeah, that I don't see what's wrong with this. Like, this preacher knows what he's talking about. I think we see this a lot more nowadays about pretty much any topic. People just sort of don't trust what academics and science says, and I'm just going to do my own research and stuff. So I think we see this a lot more nowadays. But this was one that was really poignant, because poignant to linguists, because we were on the bad side. We were on the side that society didn't like,
Yeah.
and it was just so close to home to us, because this is literally what we study. So anyway, that's the Oakland Ebonics controversy in a nutshell, probably a very large nutshell.
No, very large nutshell. I'm gonna make I'm gonna make a clip on this. Is like, linguist has a meltdown over over linguistic ideology. This kid. Well,
It is a really
It is.
fascinating like thing that happened, like a national phenomenon, like something that really, like you said, like the school board did not anticipate this creating the waves that it did.
Yeah.
in a way, it's kind of insulting, because insulting to linguists themselves because they'll imagine you're a heart surgeon, and then you're listening to an opinion of a guy who's like, I don't know, a chiropractor. No offense to chiropractors, but like the guy's like
It's totally different.
just totally different.
Yeah.
Just totally different. It's like what's like I'm a surgeon. I do surgery, and you don't. Yeah, so it's kind of like that.
Right.
Yeah, next.
I mean, we see it a lot nowadays with anything having to do with things like vaccines and climate change
Sure.
and lots of things. Scientists are all weighing in and saying definitively all the same thing, and then you get these people who think they know what they're doing that say other things, and for like, oh, that's actually a pretty good point that they're making. All the scientists are pulling out the hair. It's like I literally am the expert on this, and no one is listening to me. So
Right.
this is not a new thing. This is a thing that that has become so mainstream that we don't even like think about it too much anymore. But this was something that was maybe one of the earlier cases in American English or in American culture, and it just has to do with language. And so linguists really like to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, maybe one last kind of aspect of African American English in our final few minutes here that we wanted to talk about was its origins. Like, where did it come from?
Oh yeah.
And now we have all these various issues and things related to it, but what are the origins?
Yeah, so much ink has been spilt on the debate on the origins of African American English. There are two main sides of the argument. One is that it is it started off as what's called a creole, which is a way of using language that is sort of a combination of various languages that arises in situations where people need to create a language in order to communicate with each other. Where it started off as a language like this and slowly turned into something closer to standard American English. So that's the Creole origin hypothesis. The other hypothesis is the English origin hypothesis, where it started off as just English, just like any other variety of English, and over the course of 400 years, it doesn't diverge, just as any other English accent has diverged, but it has more influences from African languages and so that's why it sort of went in a sort of a different direction than other varieties of English. The really interesting thing is that there's really compelling evidence for the Creole hypothesis, and then there's also really, really compelling evidence for the English origins hypothesis. So I don't do research on this, so I'm not going to like decide one way or the other, but
Sure.
Linguists talked about this for 20 or 30 years, and then I don't know, about 10 or 15 years ago, they're like, you know what, let's just agree to disagree. So there's as far as I know, there's not a lot of research on this nowadays, but the debate hasn't been settled. And so
Yeah.
so there we don't really know what happened. I personally think it's probably a combination of the two, but I don't know if that's I don't have a lot of insight into it, so that's just my relatively uninformed opinion about that.
Interesting. Maybe you can just spend a couple more minutes talking about creoles and
Oh yeah.
why those are interesting.
They are really interesting. So normally when languages develop, they developed what we call in sort of a natural sense, where the clearest case that people might be familiar with is Latin turning into Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, etc. Where there was one language, and now you fast forward 2,000 years, and now we have several languages because people go off into to different areas, #dialectology. And then after a while, they become so different that people don't or aren't able to understand people that speak this supposedly the same language, but on the other side of the continent or the country. And then it's like, you know what? I don't even think we speak the same language anymore. I'm going to call my language, and then you can call your language, and then we have new languages that form. So that's sort of maybe the most common way that languages form, is they sort of split apart from each other. In some extreme language context situations, you get cases where people are thrown together who don't share a common language and they need to communicate. So this often happens in colonization situations, or even things that are less bad, like just trade. So you get things where you get one group of people who comes into some new area. They don't share a common language, but they want to trade or they want to communicate with these people. And so the two groups of people sort of unconsciously decide to cobble together a language as sort of a mix between the two of them. It often takes part of the grammar of one language and part of the words of another language, but it's not quite that simple, but that's sort of what is going on there. And after a few, if that language context situation is persistent, like for several decades, you might get what's called a pidgin that forms, which is a sort of loosely cobbled together language that's pretty variable, and it's no one's native language. It's just sort of this thing that you do when you're in the marketplace talking to these kinds of people. You speak this way to them. So if that context situation is very persistent for a long time, it might spread to more than just the marketplace. You might see it starting to spread to other places where people talk to each other, maybe on the boats, or we're working in other environments. You might see it spread to church settings, or maybe even maybe some government settings. And eventually it gets to be sort of the lingua franca of this particular speech community, where you know that if you're talking to a stranger, you can talk to them in this pidgin. Eventually you get people who have kids, and those two people, the only language they share is their second language, which is their pidgin, and so the language of the home becomes the pidgin. And so then what we get children who grow up speaking this pidgin as their first language. Now, the interesting thing about pidgins is that it's not a full-fledged language, meaning you can't talk about everything. There aren't enough words for everything. It has a relatively simple grammatical structure, but children, when that's all they're given, are amazing because they fill in the gaps. They start to create new words using the vocabulary that they have. They start to fill in gaps as far as language goes. And so these native speaking children, they turn the language into a full-fledged language, and it's at that point that we call it a creole. And so this creole then is the first language of these children, and it's sort of this more mature version of the pidgin that their parents and grandparents spoke, or I guess probably do still speak. And so a creole is just an interesting case where a language can be created, but not in sort of a typical genealogical way that most other languages tend to be formed. It's sort of this one that arises somewhat spontaneously in a relatively short amount of time, and it doesn't have a clear lineage to one language or the other. It just sort of is its own thing. And eventually that creole can be pretty widespread, where it's not even clear that it was once a creole. It has a full-fledged writing system and poetry and different styles and different regional dialects. It can have just all the complexity that any language has. There are some languages that are just called Creole or some form of that. So in Africa and some parts of the Caribbean, there are languages that are just called Creole. And so people just think of Creole as broken English because it often has a lot of connections to English, because English was the colonizer's language. And so it uses a lot of words. And so people think of it as, oh, it's like weird broken English and they must be dumb because they don't know what's going on. But really it's a separate language with a lot of influences from English. It has its full intricate complexities just as English does, just in a slightly different way. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for covering a wide variety of topics.
You're welcome.
One last question.
Yeah.
What is the one thing that you wish society knew about language and its role?
I think if I could shout from the rooftop something, it would be, everyone has an accent, and that's okay. Like, you have an accent. Like, that's an okay thing. Like, accents are fine. They're not bad things. You can understand each other. We don't need to sound the same. Like, that would be the one thing that I wish everybody could know, is that language variation is not a bad thing. It's not a bug. It's a feature of language. And we should be much more willing to embrace the variation that does exist, because it's one thing that makes language such a cool thing. And what humans are capable of is, how do we handle and negotiate all this variation? Anyway, so that's what I would shout. Yeah. So
Amazing.
What is cool about variation is podcast variation, because Sophie's phone ran out of memory again.
We love that.
No judging on podcasts based on technical difficulties. No, yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley.
you're welcome. This was super fun.
Appreciate it.
We appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
All right.
You have an accent and no judging.
That's right. I can pop my knuckles now in peace.
I've been doing that the whole podcast.